Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending tonight's speaker event series with the Institute of Politics, former Attorney General Bill Barr, his journey, and the law. My name is Jack Moore, and I'm a fourth year in the college studying economics and history, and I am an undergraduate liaison with the Student Advisory Board at the Institute of Politics. And it is my pleasure to introduce our guest for tonight, Mr. William Bill Barr, and the moderator, Ms. Jan Crawford. Under former President George H.W. Bush, Bill Barr served as Attorney General of the United States from 1991 to 1993. 26 years later, Mr. Barr was confirmed as Attorney General of the United States in February of 2019, when under former President Donald Trump. He served until December 23rd of 2020 when he announced his resignation, thus ending a career, making him one of only two men to ever serve as Attorney General of the United States twice. Our second guest, Ms. Jan Crawford, is a former UChicago law graduate and chief legal correspondent at CBS News. She has interviewed 9 Supreme Court justices over her 36-year career in journalism, and in fact, Ms. Crawford was Chief Justice John Roberts' first ever televised interview. I ask now that the audience please silence and shut off all cell phones. Please line up at the microphone during the Q&A period to ask your questions, and as always, we give priority to student questions at these events. The next speaker series events take place on October 30th. Those are the State of U.S.-China Relations at the IOP at 11 a.m. and African Democracy in the Balance at the Harris School of Public Policy at 5:30 p.m. Please visit the IOP website for details on this event. After the conclusion of tonight's event, the IOP Student Advisory Board will be hosting a spin room at the IOP House discussing the topics talked about tonight. Please join us. Without further ado, please welcome Mr. Bill Barr and Ms. Jan Crawford.
Thank you, Jack, for that introduction. And I just want to start by saying thanks to you all for coming out tonight to hear our conversation. Thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for agreeing to do it. This is, I understand, your first time on a college campus since you left the administration.
Right.
Yeah. So that's, I think it says a lot about the University of Chicago, the Institute of Politics, and the terrific work that you guys do, and of course the community that you've chosen this as your first place to be. I graduated from here in 1993. That was a long time ago, and when I rocked up on campus today, it's very different in terms of how nice it is. Wow. And the hotels, and it's quite different. But one thing that has not changed, including this place and the pub, is the commitment that U of C has to free expression and a rigorous study of critical thinking. And I think that's a reflection here tonight. And I really appreciate this opportunity to be here. And thank you for agreeing to do this.
Well, thank you, and thank IOP for inviting me. You know, there's a lot of talk about threats to democracy, and I think actually the most clear and present danger to democracy is the undermining of our First Amendment values, because before voting comes deliberation, debate. That's essential to self-government. It's not just all about getting out the vote. And so it's critically important for our society to have open and robust debate, and that's what IOP stands for. So I was happy to attend.
So let's get to it. Ready?
Yep.
I thought I'd start in this kind of continuing on the University of Chicago theme with your book, which is, and I brought a copy if you guys have not gotten one. Thanksgiving, Christmas is coming up, so you can get it on Amazon. It's called One Damn Thing After Another. Tell us about that title.
So that title comes from a discussion that William French Smith had when Reagan told him that he was going to appoint him as the Attorney General. And so this was in 1980. So William French Smith went to the last Republican Attorney General, who was Ed Levy, formerly of the University of Chicago, obviously. And Ed was sort of known as had that academic bearing, the tweed and the bow tie and the pipe. And William French Smith said, Ed, tell me about the job of Attorney General. And he was expecting to have this sort of lecture about the rule of law and the founder's vision and so forth. And Levy sort of puffed on his pipe and said, it's one damn thing after another. So that story passed down to all the attorneys general since. And I thought it was an excellent description of my tenure as Attorney General.
And that was my next question.
Yeah.
Did it prove to be, I assume,
It
accurate?
was, yes, it was one damn, it's always been one damn thing after another, but it's hard for me to believe that there were more trying circumstances, at least in recent history, than trying to serve in this administration, given the political climate. I will say that my chief of staff was Ed Levy's grandson, Will Levy.
When you decided to join the Trump administration, and I think this is something that people, and I know many of you out here committed to public service, may be weighing, and certainly Republicans weighed. Some chose to stay on the sidelines, almost in protest, to not work for the administration. Others decided to do what they could, and you were in the latter camp. You had a very successful career, you had a sterling reputation, and you were willing to take that chance to go in and serve as Trump's second Attorney General. Why did you do that?
Well, there are a number of reasons. I had no desire to go back in. It was, to me, personally, it was just downside.
You didn't seek out the job?
Not at all, no. And in fact, I was advancing other people. I knew that the president was going to lower the boom on Jeff Sessions after the midterm election. And so conservative legal circles were abuzz about who should be put forward as the successor, and I was throwing names out of people that I thought would do a good job. And the day after the midterms, the counsel to the president, who at that time was Emmett Flood, came to my office at
Also University of Chicago guys.
Yeah. Came to my office
Shout out.
at Kirkland and Ellis in D.C. and said, well, I'd like to put your name forward. And I said, no. And so then we kicked around some other names. But over time, a lot of people were pushing me with the president. The president kept on saying he wanted to talk to me because a lot of people on the Hill and elsewhere were saying you really have to talk to Barr. The things that eventually drove me to do it are, one, I'm a Republican. I've always been a Republican, and I was very comfortable with Trump's policies. And so I thought his administration was potentially being sabotaged, and there was an effort to essentially run him out of office with this bogus Russiagate thing. At the time, I was very suspicious of this Russiagate thing. It didn't add up to me. And I didn't see many members of the bar, stepping forward to help deal with this crisis. And I thought that it was very unfair that he was the duly elected president. I didn't support him for the nomination. I supported Jeb Bush, and then I supported Rubio. But once he got the nomination, I supported his election. And so I felt he was the duly elected president, should have an opportunity to run his administration without being, run out of town on this. And there was a feeding frenzy going on. Also, I was very upset by what was happening at the department. It was in turmoil. It was being attacked from both sides, both Republicans from the Hill, Democrats, and so forth. And it was, dysfunctional. Now, I had 2 daughters there, 2 son-in-laws at the department. I know the department pretty well. And I felt, someone has to come in there and deal with this who understands the department. And, my daughters were originally against me doing it, but eventually they started saying, they need leadership now, and you might be in the best position to do it. So I also thought that in the current environment, the job, you really need to be somebody who's at the end of your career, not looking forward to anything else, because you're going to I realized I was going to get barbecued, and I would have been afraid to do what I think was the right decision simply because of the political consequences. And so I felt there weren't that many people who were in the mix. In fact, I didn't know of anyone in the mix that was in a similar position. So those were the reasons I said, well, look, if the president wants to talk to me, I'll only talk to him if I was willing to accept it if asked. And I got over that hump and I went and talked to him, and he, at the first discussion, he said he wanted me to serve. So.
You went into it with your eyes open, though. You knew of Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I was under no illusions. I knew it was going to be tough duty. I didn't know him personally, but I'd worked up in New York, commuted back home to Virginia. But I'm a New Yorker, and I was working up in New York for Verizon as the general counsel, and I had been on some boards of people who knew Trump very well, including people who had worked in the Trump organization. And all along they were saying, oh, this guy's bad news, don't go near him, and so forth and so on. And I learned a lot about him that way. I was under no illusions. I wasn't going in to be his buddy or his factotum, but I felt that the Department of Justice, the FBI are critical institutions, and I thought that I, given what I felt was my independence, that I wasn't worried about the next thing I'm going to do, that I could do a good job.
What did you learn kind of about Trump that helped prepare you to be Attorney General in terms of dealing with him? And what surprised you?
Well,
he did try to fire you at least once.
Well, yeah, at the very end, because I said that the election wasn't stolen. But, it's not black and white. He's not the devil incarnate. He has some good characteristics, and he can be charming and pleasant and friendly and so forth. One thing I found out about him is that as a New Yorker and someone who really didn't care very much about what he thought of me, I wasn't performing for him. That I could just be very frank and direct, and I don't think many of the cabinet secretaries were. And they would, oh, Mr. President, the whole world is just applauding your last speech and blah 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 blah. And they blow smoke for a while, and then they get to the point they want. And he could see that, and I was a little bit more direct. So I think that helped our relationship. That we're that was sort of bottom line with him. But he's a very manipulative person, and it quickly appeared, I quickly recognized that as long as he thinks he's getting his way, he's fine. But if you're not giving him the advice he wants, if you're not giving him the advice he wants, he will try to figure out ways of getting around it, and you won't necessarily know it's happening. When
did that happen in your experience?
Well, a perfect example of it was the Ukrainian situation, where he wasn't happy with that there had been no investigation of the firing of Shokin, the prosecutor in Ukraine, and the role that Hunter Biden may have played in that, and so he sort of set up this do-it-yourself investigation with Rudy Giuliani and all that stuff, and there were all kinds of communications going on that no one in the government knew about. Certainly I didn't know about them, and I don't think the national security people knew about them. So it was sort of a self-help program. And every time that happened, of course, it would blow up in his face. The other big episode, I mean, there are a lot of little examples too, but where you'd say no, and next thing you know, you heard that someone at DHS got a call to see if that they would give the advice that, we were not giving. And then he would frequently go to outside people. But the other big example was January 6th. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't getting the answers he wanted from, the people in the government, so he created this little ad hoc Keystone Cops operation that led to January 6th.
Mm-hmm. When you submitted your resignation, you put out a pretty nice tweet about you, and you thought that basically you could leave the department then because
It was
the
December
stuff
14th.
right, and everything was pretty much settled.
Yeah. So on December
Which
14th.
obviously it wasn't. Later we found out, according
Right.
to Trump.
So it was December 1st, I told the AP that we had yet to see evidence that would have changed fraud that would have changed the outcome of the election. And that zoomed around, and the president was upset, very, very angry about that. And I was going over to the White House later anyway, and I knew I was going into a heated situation. And I told my secretary, you might have to pack up for me because he's going to tell me not to go home after he fires me. Oh, he's not going to fire you. Well, I went over and
They also say, well, you could still come back? People, that happens
oh, yeah,
all
she
the
said,
time.
he always says that, just come back. That's what she said, yeah. So, but he's not going to fire you. I said, well, I'm not so sure. So I went over and you can buy the book and read the prologue because that's what it's about. I went into the Oval and back into a little dining room that he has, and there was a very heated discussion. And during it, I kept on explaining to him the various episodes he was relying on did not show fraud. And then he started complaining that I hadn't indicted people like Comey and others that were his enemies. And I said, look, Mr. President, I know you're not happy with me. And if you want me to resign, and then boom, he hit the table and said, accepted. And then he hit it again, boom. And there were about 5 other people in the room, and everyone was jumping. So I said, okay. And I walked out, and I went to get in my black FBI Suburban right near the White House, and all of a sudden pounding on the windows, and it was 2 lawyers that had come out, including the counsel to the president.
And they chased you down.
They
to stop you.
chased me down, and they said, he didn't mean it. He wants you. He sent us to bring. He said, the first thing he said was, get Bill back here and all that stuff. I said, well, that's fine, but I'm not going back in there tonight. And then I talked to them later, and they wanted me to stay as long as I didn't blindside them. And I said, I'm not going to blindside. You'll know what I'm thinking at any time. And on December 14th was the day that all the states send certified votes in to the Congress. And the states had certified the votes, and there were no disputes in the states. I mean, maybe Joe Sixpack had a dispute, but there was no official dispute underway. So these were final certified votes. And on December 14th, I felt that it was over and there could be no more mischief. And I wrote a letter of resignation and went in to give it to him.
We're going to get to January 6th in a minute, but when we talked, it was in 2019. We did an interview with you then. And you said in 2019 that you had a good professional working relationship with the president.
Right. I didn't have a problem with a lot of people would say, why didn't you speak up earlier? Well, December 1st was the time I had a big disagreement with him.
About fraud in the election.
About fraud in the election. Up until the election, up until his defeat in the election, there were irritations and they were having to do battle and push back and so forth. But
what would be some of the examples of that? I mean, sure. Setting aside January 6th and the whole concept of like fraud in the election, what were some of the bigger struggles you had to kind of keep the check there, keep that line?
Well, one of the big ones was over the summer of the election year with the rioting going on around the country. But I would just want to say that up until the election, I didn't have any major problem with Trump. We got along okay, and I was fine with the policies, and we defended the policies, and we won. And people say, it's a lawless administration. Show me something that we had done that was lawless. But
well, people also said that you were his most loyal defender, suggesting. I always thought that was a little
yeah, the media in Washington was annoyed with me because they felt I was propping him up. They felt they sort of had him on the ropes with Russiagate, and that by coming in, I stabilized the situation, and they were irritated. And almost right away, they started calling me, that I was arch loyal and is loyal, this and loyal that. Yeah, I am loyal to the administration. You're in the president's cabinet. I'm a Republican. But you're also loyal to the Constitution. And, your job as Attorney General is to help the president faithfully execute the laws, which means making sure that the criminal justice decisions in the criminal justice arena are not made on the basis of politics. And so, I'm loyal to the president to a point, but ultimately you're loyal to your oath.
And therefore, you would have some conflicts with him, disagreements on what.
Yeah, we had disagreements, but the one that became probably the most grating. I mean, there were occasions where he'd want to do something that we said was not legal, and he'd bellyache about it for a long time, and he'd get legal experts to say we were wrong, and we'd push back and so. But it was during the riots where he wanted to use the military and go into cities, especially Seattle and Portland, to use regular military troops. And things were had quieted down around the country, and I felt that if we sent troops into Portland, for example, there'd be immediate upsurge all around the country, and then we'd be using the military all throughout the country. And I didn't think there was a need to do that. Portland was stewing in its own juices in the sense that none of the judges would have supported us, not even the federal judges. And so I said to the president, what are our troops going to do? What are we going to do, Mr. President? They're going to be standing there with fixed bayonets? The only federal thing we're defending right now is the courthouse. We have it defended. We can defend it with U.S. Marshals, and we're doing it. What's the military going to do? Are we going to just go off and grab people and then bring them before a magistrate? The magistrate will let them go. It'll just show impotence. So my advice was not to do that, and that was a source of contention. Obviously, the military was on the same side I was on that issue.
And then fast forward to January 6th when he did nothing to defend the Capitol.
Right.
Tell me about what you felt watching those images. Like, I know that your longtime head of public affairs called you and said, "Turn on the TV." A lot of this is in your book.
Yeah. So I'd resigned. Obviously, I was at home in my library.
Did you expect? Because again, in the run-up to January 6th, there was some talk that something might happen or Trump was going to. I mean, were you?
No, I had heard. I'd heard in someone on the margin of some conversation saying something like, "Oh, there's going to be a rally on January 6th. Oh, wait, January 6th will be a big rally." So in my mind's eye, I had this idea of one of his usual rallies, with beach chairs and everything else, and him going through his usual shtick, and that's what I thought was going to happen on January 6th. And I wasn't paying that much, I wasn't reading much about this. So I was at home in my study, and my head of public affairs called up and said, "Do you see what's happening on the Hill?" And I turned on the television and saw it, and it was a sickening spectacle.
You said sickening spectacle?
Yeah, it was a sickening. I mean, especially, the attacks on the police really, I mean, if you go after a policeman who's holding a line like that, which was an authorized line, and they're attacking him and hitting him with stuff and breaking into the Capitol, breaking through the glass and stuff. So old habits die hard. I said to them, she was no longer at the department. She left the same day I did. I said, put out this statement. So I put out a statement about the need to disperse those people right away.
Which was certainly well in advance of hearing from the president at all.
Right. It was before anyone in the government said anything. But so then.
But let me ask you this: you're sitting there watching, a mob, fighting with police to access the Capitol to disrupt a proceeding that's at the heart of our democracy, right? You went into the administration because of your belief that our institutions have to be protected and defended. Right. What personally was that like for you, thinking, what does he do? Did you, I mean, like,
Well, I mean, there
did you
was-
think he's doing this? What is he doing? Did you think I got to call him? I've got to.
Well, I was wondering, one of the things I wondered is, was this actually coordinated? And that's why, I didn't bellyache about an investigation into it, because I wondered, were people actually involved in orchestrating this thing in order to delay the vote? I think that's a legitimate question to ask. So that was running through my mind, is this part of a scheme to block the vote?
Wait, let me ask you, just to clarify that. You're saying, when you say you thought an investigation was important.
Well, later on,
you didn't complain. You didn't bellyache about the.
No,
you didn't complain about
I think
it.
there were
You didn't
legitimate
object.
questions. I didn't, think about what form it should take, whether it should be Congress or the Department of Justice, but I think there were some questions that had to be answered about what happened that day. Now, myself, I have certain views about dealing with civil disorder, which go back to even my first time as Attorney General. And because I dealt with the LA riots in 1992, which up until may even still be the most cost. No, I guess the ones in 2020 were probably more costly because they went on a longer time. But and I feel you have to have at hand, not necessarily all out on the street, but at least in locations very close by, you have to have overwhelming force, because you have to control the situation. When I say force, I mean officers, trained in civil control. And so National Guard MPs are the best to use for that. And, we had 1,200 of them in the DC National Guard. So, I mean, I was surprised that there was not more of a federal presence that could react quickly, because I think you have to do that. And I think there's going to be there's a lot of debate as to, some people say that Pelosi didn't want them, and there's all kinds of finger pointing back and forth. But that's one of the things that alarmed me right at the beginning, is where's the federal reinforcements? So I got calls from inside the Capitol, from a number of the offices, some of the leadership offices, from people who were trapped in there, and people were pounding on the door, and they were scared. And they were pleading with me to try, and even though I was no longer at the department, to get some help. And so I got word to the appropriate people at the FBI, and they sent up a SWAT team, a couple of SWAT teams, and did extract them. But that was my January 6th.
When you say that you, didn't bellyache about the fact that there's going to be an investigation, and you had questions about what happened in January 6th, there's certain things that you'd like to know about what led to that. What are some of the things that what are some of the unanswered questions that you have?
Well, I think they were probably looking at it, which is, was there a plan to use violence to delay the vote? That would be a serious crime in my mind. So I think, all this talk of January 6th and these groups that came in, and they were loaded for bear, and they were looking for a fight. They're dressed up like they're SWAT teams and so forth, and it looked like there was a lot of pre-planning involved. So I thought that had to be run down. Now, the fact that the Department of Justice has not charged anybody at higher levels with involvement, with planning violence, would suggest that they didn't find evidence of that.
What is just based on your knowledge of Trump and kind of his mental state going into January 6th, what's your sense of, what did he do?
His state of mind?
Yeah, what's your sense of what was he doing on January 6th? Obviously, we know he didn't try to.
I wasn't there.
But
what I heard from my friends at the White House was that there was a big delay of almost 3 hours while this spectacle unfolded on television, and during which many people were going in and pleading with him to do something about it, and ask his followers to come out of the Capitol. And I think one of the issues at trial is going to be what happened during that period. And I think they'll probably trot in a lot of witnesses who pled with him to stop the violence. And I think his attitude during that is going to be part of the government's case to establish his state of mind and his intent.
We now have kind of a presidential candidate who is facing 4 separate indictments, 2 federal, 2 state, potentially trials. Obviously, it looks like now we will have trials even before the election.
Yeah, but if I could, because I usually go down this answering these questions, but I also want to say that I said when I was up for my confirmation hearing that one of the things I was most concerned about in the country, this was 2 years before, was lack of confidence in the integrity of elections, because we're a very closely divided country with big policy, philosophical differences between the parties, and that we have to have peaceful transition of power is our ace in the hole. And if we lose that, and if people don't have confidence in the outcome, and there is fundamental difference of opinion as to who won the election, we're headed to a very dark place. And so even in the run-up to the election, I kept on pointing out, there are 2 different issues. One issue is whether there's fraud. Another issue is, if there's so much gamesmanship going on in the states and rules being changed at the last minute and things like harvesting and other things that raise the possibility of fraud, increase the likelihood of fraud, then people aren't going to have confidence in the outcome. And that's one, even if whether you prove it or not, they're not going to have confidence in the outcome. And I thought the Democrats were playing with fire in the lead up to the election by making all these changes. And I said that, they're playing with fire.
But some of them were related to COVID.
Well, related in a sort of, yeah. But I think both parties, if we want to keep this country together, if we want to keep this country together, we have to focus on providing assurance that these elections are done properly. Now, the fact is, in this particular case, I don't see any evidence of fraud that would have changed the outcome, and I think most of the things that were being cited were ludicrously false. But that doesn't mean we can let our guard down. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sorry, so you were talking about the cases.
No. I mean, it's, and when you talk about having confidence in the outcome of the election, obviously.
Well, one of the things that really bothered me, the January 6th, in my mind, took place against the backdrop of an incumbent administration appearing to be laying the groundwork for staying in power without coming forward with definitive and compelling evidence that they won the election.
Well, there was none.
Well, that's right. So my view is, how can we accept a situation where the incumbent administration just gets to say, we have no proof, but we think this was stolen, and then we're going to stay in power? Where was that going to go? Where was that going to go?
The polls show it's a pretty tight race right now for 2024. Mm-hmm. What is your biggest concern about a Trump presidency in 2024? Well,
I have concerns about a Biden presidency, too.
That was not my question.
I don't want to be faced with the choice between those 2 individuals.
Well, I think that I think Trump, America would agree with you on that. The polls
but as
show
to
that
Trump,
too.
One of the reasons I'm so frustrated about Trump is because I believe, left to their own devices and with a quasi-normal Republican conservative candidate, the country would elect a center-right government by a large margin, with both the House and Senate going Republican. And if you look at all the battlegrounds, all the key states, Florida and Georgia, Virginia, you have conservative governors who are racking up big margins. And why isn't that happening on the national level? I think it's because of Donald Trump, and the polls show that. I mean, the independent, a lot of people have left the Republican Party from the suburbs and become independents, and he's not picking those people back up. So it'll be a tight race probably, but Biden is making it much easier for him to win if he's the nominee with the incompetence of his administration, in my opinion.
But let me just stop there, because sometimes I just find myself thinking, really? I mean, we're really talking about Trump 2024, after January 6th, you could go through other things, but I mean, how is that not disqualifying? How?
Pinch me. I'm stunned by it, but what's happening is that a lot of the voters, conservative voters, a lot of working class voters who have recently come into the Republican Party are very angry. They're angry and frustrated, and I think this is reflected in their attitude, which is sort of, the hell with you all, we need someone to really shake up the system. And so many of them are not listening to reason, and they're not interested in, what it would actually take to win the kind of victory that it could allow you to install your policies.
What do you think Trump would be like as president if he wins in 24?
Well, he's already saying it's going to be about retribution, and he's a very petty man, and it's all about him. He has a very fragile ego, and something happened to him as a kid, and I'm not going to spend time psychoanalyzing it, but every encounter he has to come out showing the other guy that he's better. It's all about the assertion of his ego, and I think he will be self-indulgent in a new administration, and won't be as effective as he could otherwise be, and probably things would start moving toward chaos.
Moving toward?
Yeah.
Are you worried about the Department of Justice?
Well, yeah. The Department of Justice.
Because he's not going to pick you for Attorney General.
Yeah. So, well.
Or would you do
there
it?
are problems.
Would you do it again? A third record-setting time?
No. But the Department of Justice has problems. I think a lot of our departments and institutions have problems. They've become politicized. More and more aspects of life are politicized, not just in the government. The media is more politicized. Medicine is more politicized. Every institution is becoming more politicized, and that's true of government agencies. And I think there is a problem at the department. There's a problem at the FBI. It has to be dealt with. But it's not like turn over the chessboard and sweep all the people.
But are you worried about that if Trump goes back into the
Yeah. I'm worried that, I think it's important that someone like Trump has people around him who give him straight from the shoulder advice, aren't yes people, aren't afraid of him, and we'll try to talk sense into him when he goes off on some wild idea. And
do you see any
I don't see that.
Yeah,
I don't think there are going to be as many people around him as there were before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is his biggest flaw as a leader, I guess? Is it that it's narcissism, manipulative, petty? there's so many adjectives you've thrown out here.
Well, I think his biggest flaw is because he's actually a lot of it is a performance rather than substance. And I think his basic gambit, what he saw was the great dissatisfaction in a large portion of the Republican Party, or people who would be willing to vote Republican. And he has captured that partly by, inflamed a lot of their anger and passions. And therefore, he's more interested in performing and getting a reaction from them than he is actually solving a particular problem. So there were occasions where he would take some action, hold up his executive order, so forth. That was the thing of the day. And then you'd go in and say, okay, now, Mr. President, that's all very good, but we have to do A, B, C, and D if we really want to nail this down. I dealt with it, I want to do, let's move on to the next thing. So I think that's, and look, I think a good leader has to be able to channel the frustrations and aspirations of the people in a constructive way, and take account of the fact that he's president of all the people, and ultimately we need some degree of unity. We're all in the same boat, and if we're going to not cut each other's throats, we have to figure out a way of muddling through, and someone who's constantly rolling around in the mud and fighting at the drop of a hat, and as sort of strictly in that mode, I'm worried about them getting us through.
I mean, even the last, couple weeks or month, I thought his comments, even on Hezbollah, that was appalling. Like, it's almost like do you think is he losing it, or is he just becoming?
His verbal skills are limited, and so if you get him away from very, 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 the adjectives sort of they're unfamiliar to him, and he's not, and they sort of spill out, and he goes too far. He's not very disciplined when it comes to what he says. So.
We're going to take, you're going to answer
Sure.
some questions from the audience in a few minutes. So if you guys want to be thinking of some other questions that you would like to ask. But I guess, and I guess I can circle back with what we started with, which is, a wonderful thing about the University of Chicago, and you alluded to this, and what's so important to democracy is free speech and free expression. And we're here for that. But it seems so, and I don't know how much you think Trump has played into this, but the discourse in this country is broken. What we're seeing on campuses across the country is disturbing, isn't even the word for it.
Right.
And I wonder what your sense is now of how we move forward. While you still got Donald Trump running for president, and consuming that oxygen, seeing our country and our world at a place I never really would have expected.
Right. So it's not all about Trump. Trump is a symptom, I think, rather than the cause. And I think the decisive development in our society over the past couple of decades has been the decisive move of the Democratic Party to the left, and the left wing of the Democratic Party to the far, far left. And there's a level of condescension and elitism, condescension to the average American, that started this anger. And also, I think, some Republican elites.
The elitism.
Yeah, elites. Many Republicans had lost touch with the life of the average American. And I think ultimately, like Aristotle said, a democratic society needs to rest on the middle class. And so I've always been comfortable with the idea of some element of populism in the Republican Party. I think what's happened is that we've had leaders who have essentially used that to gain power on both the left and the right, used that anger on the left and the right and inflamed it, and we've been getting more and more polarized. But I think I would put the blame squarely on the left for getting the ball rolling here. Talk about the debate. The threat to free speech didn't come from the right. It came, in my opinion, from the left, and was manifest in universities and all the usual ways of taking things off the table. Things are off the table. And if you're a Catholic school teacher and a Catholic school is teaching traditional doctrine about marriage. It's hate speech and all this kind of, Orwellian terminology that's used. And it was basically to stop debate and intimidate people. People couldn't get jobs. If people said there are two genders, all of a sudden they're fired. That's a threat to the First Amendment. And that kind of thing is the thing that really, got under the skin of a lot of, average Americans. They thought it was crazy. And, who's going to come in and take the bull by the horns here? And that's how someone like Trump got into the picture, and he certainly made the most of it.
We're going to take some Q&As from, I guess we're going to start with students, right? But first of all, I just want to thank you again for
Thanks, Jan.
the conversation.
Thanks for doing this, Jan.
And we're going to, does anyone want to go now? While we're waiting on the first one, let me ask you this one question. A lot of people thought that when Trump when he ran for president in 2016, these years, that he would it was kind of part of his act, right? Like he was kind of expressing, I hear you, I'm a man of the people, and that he would moderate kind of his tone and become more presidential. I mean, obviously that didn't happen.
Right.
I guess finally, did you expect that in 2016? And again, I keep asking, what's your bottom line? If he goes in the White House in 2024, what do you expect?
So, I had hoped that he would rise to the occasion in 2016 and be a little bit more statesman-like and understand that this is a unique role and he's leader of the country and president of all the people and so forth. And, at the end of the day, he didn't do that. But on the other hand, I do blame this whole, both the left and the media for going for this Russiagate big lie, and the way they pursued him and hounded him, especially after the election, where the evidence was overwhelming at that point that this whole thing was a hoax. And they went for him. And he shows up in Washington. His victory speech was actually very statesmanlike. He's very complimentary to Hillary Clinton and so forth. And then he gets into D.C. and actually it was up while he was still up in the tower, and he's confronted with the tapes of the Russian hookers in the hotel and all the supposed stories, and he's saying, "Oh, wait a minute now, this is a coup. They're coming after me." And so I think that I'm not saying he would have been Abraham Lincoln had he been left alone by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think his behavior in office was affected by what he felt was a treacherous effort to drive him out of office.
And in 2024, bottom line.
As I said, we'll jump off that bridge when we get to it.
All right, if you want to.
Hello, General. Thank you for the opportunity. So I want to circle back to a moment about the Mueller report when it was released. You did not release the full report after it was published, but instead you published a certain page of conclusion. What was your logic at the time, and what was the internal deliberations inside the Department of Justice at the time that you decided that you didn't want to release the full report at the first place? Thank you.
So I met with Mueller several weeks. Let me see, what was the exact date? I can't remember. But anyway, I met with him, and he was giving me a heads up of what they were going to do, and he verbally told me what they were going to do, which was he said there was no collusion, but that he's not reaching a conclusion on obstruction. He was just going to set forth these factual vignettes and just not take a position. So we pressed him on that and asked him why and so forth. But what I said to him was, look, when you give me that report, I cannot afford to have a long delay between the time you give me the report and the time we make your conclusions known, because people will know when I get the report. It'll be all over the news, and if there's any delay, people will say that he's going to prison, he's going to be prosecuted. So you have to sanitize that report before you give it to me. You have to take out grand jury material, which is against the law to make public. 6E, it's a crime to make that public. So you have to take that out of the report. You have to take out classified information. And they said they would when they gave it to me. They would indicate, because I said, we have no way of knowing what's 6E and what isn't. And we don't even, you know what's classified, you know what's 6E, identify it so we can quickly redact it and get it out without delay. He said he would. When they gave me the report, it was all over the news, not every page said on it, this page contains 6E material, releasing it is a crime. No indication of what had to be taken out. They didn't do what they said. So I was confronted on Friday with all the news shows saying, well, the president's going to go to jail, they could start arresting people and all this stuff. We have an economy, we have foreign policy interests, we can't, we have to worry about what our adversaries think is going on. And I felt I couldn't wait. Our estimate was it would take 2 to 3 weeks to sanitize, to go through and get everything out and work with the prosecutors to do that. And so I said, I have to put something out in the meantime, and I'm going to state the conclusions of the report. So I stated the conclusions of the report, including verbatim quote from what he said about obstruction. And then I went on to say, but we've looked at the obstruction stuff that he sets forth, and we don't think that that would amount to a crime. And then I described why we thought that. That was describing my decision. By the way, Mueller worked for me. He was a U.S. attorney. He had the equivalent of a U.S. attorney. There's no power except the power of the Attorney General. And it's the Attorney General that, it's a report that under this regulation is given to the Attorney General in confidence, and it's up to the Attorney General what to do with it. So normally they would not be released, and that rule was adopted after Clinton by Janet Reno, because they don't like these reports going out. I said, I'll make the report public. So we put that out. We put out the statement. Now, the point I've made is there's nothing, people say, well, you didn't put out the report. Yeah, I didn't put out the report because I had to wait to put out the report, but it was coming out in a couple of weeks, and I made that clear. And I didn't mischaracterize the report. To this day, I defy anyone to show me anything in that letter that is not an accurate representation exactly of what Mueller did. They frequently point to the subsequent paragraph where I explain my decision and say, well, that's not Mueller's decision. That's right, it's not Mueller's decision. This is my decision. If people don't like it, that's fine. But you have to also remember that there was never going to be an indictment at that point, because for the same reason, you see now, you don't indict a sitting president. So the question was always, is Congress going to do something? 2 weeks after I put out that report, if Congress thought there was a problem, what's to prevent them from impeaching? They didn't. There was crickets. There was no effort to impeach the president for obstruction. They were quiet. So, basically, it was a temper tantrum. This attack on my handling of the report is a temper tantrum by the Washington media mostly, and by some of the Democrats on the Hill, who were desperate that Mueller was going to be their St. George killing the dragon, and they were very frustrated, and didn't turn out that way. So, anyway, that's why it was done that way.
Thank you, General.
Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Barr. Thanks for being here today.
Sure.
You mentioned concession and the peaceful transfer of power a lot. Twice in the last 25 years, we've seen challenges and rough transitions. First with Al Gore challenging the outcome of votes in Florida, and later, of course, with Donald Trump in several swing states. In both cases, these polarized situations had adverse effects. The delayed transition between the Clinton and Bush administrations is said to have led to the U.S.'s vulnerability to terrorism and eventually 9/11. Likewise, Trump's challenges to the 2020 election culminated in the January 6th insurrection. My question is, how do you think this recent trend of challenging election results should be interpreted and addressed? Do you think a solution might involve a bill or even a constitutional amendment?
Well, elections are run by the states under the Constitution. It's a state function, even though these are federal offices. So the running and policing of an election is done by the states. That's just something I tried to explain repeatedly to President Trump, that the Department of Justice can look into fraud, criminal fraud, but we don't have some kind of general commission to go around validating election results. That's the state's responsibility and the courts. But I've said, I think given the closeness, how close the divisions in the United States are and how consequential they are, we have to come up with procedures in the states that are above reproach. Now, the good thing about Florida is it learned from Bush v. Gore, and they have a very good and quick election. I mean, they can get the results quickly, and there isn't a peep about their accuracy, even though they have mail-in voting, for absentee ballots and so forth. So it's possible to construct good systems that win the support of the people and people have trust in, but a lot of the states aren't doing that. And, I think we have to push them to do it. Instead of trying to game it, I think, for the parties to go in and try to game the system, why, not having IDs, for example, or Jim Baker and former President Carter did a commission, I think it was in 2005, and the two things that they pointed out that raised concerns because they were open to fraud were harvesting ballots, which I think is an abomination because it does away with the secret ballot. The whole reason we have secret ballots is to make sure there's not undue duress or buying votes and so forth. But that opens the door to that if you have harvesting. And the other one was mail-in ballots. Those were the two things they identified, President Carter and Jim Baker, and I think they were right. So I just think we have to be, if people continue to game the system like this and try to, the other thing is our elections are turning into no longer deliberative operations, but mobilization. It's like you just mobilize people to get out to vote. It's less a deliberative process these days.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening, sir. Thank you for being here. My name is Christopher Phillips. I'm a third year in the college. I'm wondering, many conservatives have expressed grave concerns about what they perceive to be the politicization of the Department of Justice. And you spoke on it a bit, but I'd like to know more about the degree to which you believe that to be true, and perhaps you can analyze the particular case of the prosecution of Hunter Biden. Do you think that has been sufficient? And then perhaps what are some prescriptions that you might offer to alleviate this issue in the future?
Well, starting with the thing on, I think a lot of what President Trump says is right, and it strikes a lot of Americans as right on the money. And so when he says something like, hey, if this was one of my kids, he'd already, be wearing an orange jumpsuit, he's right on that. There is a double standard in our system. It's not as bad as people frequently portray it, but it's there. The best way for me to describe it, though, is to say, this is not just an FBI, DOJ problem. This is institutions. All institutions have a certain value that they have to uphold because it's part of the bigger picture. So, for example, media is supposed to try to get at the objective truth. That should be the value that drives coverage. And Justice Department has to uphold certain things like due process and so forth. But the department has to try to come out with the best idea of what the facts are and how the law should apply. Now, the corruption of our institutions that is happening in every institution is where people get into the institution and they sacrifice the institutional value for what they consider a higher political goal. And they justify their behavior that way. And so a newspaper reporter shades the story or is more committed to a narrative and is less concerned whether the narrative actually corresponds to objective truth. And the same thing in the Department of Justice. People can convince themselves that some higher political purpose justifies putting their thumb on the scale on a particular case, or by leaking information about the case. When I was at the department, any case that was embarrassing for the Republicans was leaked. The cases that were embarrassing for the Democrats, including Hunter Biden, was not leaked. That sort of tells you about the makeup. So that's the basic phenomenon. It's happening in all institutions. The department's not immune from it. And part of it is that the people coming into the department are more on the left than they had been in the past. So you see that, that bunch of barbarians out in Stanford Law School, hooting down a judge. I mean, these are law students. These are the people applying for jobs at the Department of Justice. So, keeping it on track is a full-time job. Sometimes it requires overruling the career lawyers if you feel they're being political, which I did. I personally detest Roger Stone. I think he should have been prosecuted and should go to jail. But when the line prosecutors, two of whom worked one for Obama and one for Mueller, recommended a sentence 3 times longer than is the norm, I said, no, he's not going to get special treatment because he's a friend of Trump's, but he's not going to be treated worse either. That's what the rule of law is. But I was roasted for that for God knows how long. Okay?
Thanks.
Hi, Attorney General. Thank you for coming. You've been a longtime advocate of unitary executive theory. Now you are a vocal critic of Trump, who you said defrauded Americans over the 2020 election, even though he was privately convinced he lost it. So I wonder to what extent have the Trump's anti-democratic practices, the persistent cult of personality of Trump in the Republican Party, and a portion of his base that not only vote for Trump but also fight for Trump, influenced the way you see the proper extent of executive power? Is there any change of mind?
No. I mean, this thing about unitary executive is actually sort of one of the funniest sideshows going on these days. The unitary executive refers to the point that was debated at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, which is, should you have just one person as the president, or should you have multiple, like a committee? And there was a lot of antipathy toward executive power originally because of fighting against King George III, but actually the experience in the Revolution and then the Confederation, the founding fathers started warming to the idea of a stronger executive. And so, in many ways, the miracle of Philadelphia was the setting up of a very strong executive, but a limited executive that already had all the limitations that the Whigs had achieved on the king and more in England. So it's a very interesting office that was established, but the primary thing was they said there has to be one president, just one, and he is the executive power. Okay, all executive power is vested in the president. So the unitary executive so-called theory, it's not a theory, it's what the Constitution says, is that Congress cannot, impede the president's exercise of his authority under the Constitution by trying to divide it and sort of say, well, the president can only do this if this body approves it. And so if they divide the executive power, that is a violation of the unitary executive, which is in the first sentence of Article 2. So that's what the unitary, and I've always, defended that power. The main area that this has been particularly important in is in foreign affairs, and where Congress tries to micromanage decisions that are the president's to make. So it has nothing to do with who's in office. Sometimes President Clinton took things that were, I felt, within his power, and people were attacking for it. I said, no, I think that that's a legitimate exercise of presidential authority. And so it has nothing to do with who's in power. So I'm not sure I understood the rest of the question, but that's my answer.
Sorry. Hi, Attorney General Barr.
Hi.
My name's Sophia. I'm a 3L at the law school. And so I was really interested in the fact that in 2020, you published a memo discussing an intention to create a task force against anti-government extremists. And in that memo, you discussed the Boogaloo Group, which is a known white supremacist organization. So throughout your tenure with the department, the threat of white supremacy and domestic terrorism has raised substantially. How do you think the department has raised substantially? The number of white supremacist threats has increased. Do you think that the department's counterterrorism efforts have altered in relation to that? And do you think that they were sufficiently met during your time?
So, my experience with so-called domestic terrorism is that historically, the FBI always got into trouble when they spied on domestic groups on the left. And it always led to a huge reaction, investigations, a lot of people losing their jobs, AGs putting out guidelines that limit the power of the FBI to conduct certain investigations. And all of those were on the left. They went to the anti-war movement, the civil rights movements, things like that. So the FBI is very guarded about doing anything that affects the left. Whereas it's very easy to penetrate groups on the right, or it has been traditionally. And so that is reflected in the inflow of intelligence, because if you have every motorcycle gang in the United States heavily penetrated, you're going to be getting a lot of these reports. But you get fewer reports on the left. So I think part of it is the difficulty of conducting domestic intelligence while respecting the First Amendment. It's a very delicate area, and what has happened over the years is that we have far less information about left-wing terrorism than we do right. So I don't care where they come from. I don't care whether they're on the right or left. If they pose a domestic threat, we have to deal with them. And Boogaloo, I mean, a lot of these groups are hard to pigeonhole as right or left. Boogaloo, in my opinion, is essentially a nihilistic group that wants to spawn a civil war in the United States, and it's not because they want to restore the Constitution of 1789. I'm not sure why people call them conservative, but that's the problem we face in trying to deal with domestic terrorism.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I think we're going to have time for
Okay.
2 more questions, unfortunately.
Hi, good afternoon, Mr. Barr. My name is Seth Cohen. I'm a 4th year in the college. Do you think that Congressman Comer's investigation will lead to either congressional action, legal action, or affect the election in any way? Thank you.
You mean the one on Hunter Biden?
The influence peddling, yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, that's another area that I feel really has to be thoroughly investigated. I thought it was being investigated when I left the department. There was no way that investigation was going to be completed before the 2020 election. So it's not a question of hurrying up so we can get something to win the 2020 election. That was not going to be done before the 2020 election. And therefore, really the onus at that point was to make sure that it doesn't prematurely leak out before any conclusions were reached, which was accomplished. But after the election, I thought it was going to be vigorously pursued by the Delaware U.S. Attorney's Office, and I'm wondering what happened. And a lot of the stuff that comes out now appear to be huge red flags. And I hope there's a good answer as to why those, was that known? Was the investigation thorough? And do they have answers for that? If they've come to the conclusion that there's no there, I'd like to hear it. And until I hear that, I'm not sure about what they found and what their conclusions and judgments are. But certainly the stuff you're looking at coming out is pretty damning. At least it raises a lot of red flags. And if there's something there, obviously. I mean, I've already said publicly, I'll be surprised if Biden is the nominee. And it's partly because of his obvious degeneration of his health and his, but I think coupled with it, and his unpopularity and the unpopularity of his vice president, but I also think that there could be traction on this scandal, and why the Democrats may come to the conclusion they don't want to deal with it. So, could affect that way.
And this is going to have to be, I'm sorry, the last question.
Hello. So first of all, thank you for coming here. Second of all, with the recent strike down of affirmative action in the Supreme Court, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the ruling and its future set for precedent for affirmative action's use as an equitable tool moving forward.
Well, I mean, I supported the Supreme Court's decision. I've always felt that reverse discrimination is not the way to achieve a colorblind society, and I actually think a lot of progress has been made, and we don't need the degree of affirmative action in the sense of reverse discrimination that we've had. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of guerrilla warfare played with academic institutions in the courts. It's going to take a long time to sort it out. Okay?
Are you troubled by some of what you're seeing, the attacks on the courts?
Yeah, I mean, I think all our institutions are under assault. I think the attack on the Supreme Court now, it depends whose ox is being gored. The left is very aggressive in going and trying to attack and undermined, confidence in the Supreme Court. And, this will head in the direction of just sort of saying, well, it's a political body anyway. It's not really the law. It's essentially a group of wise men that,
We're not so wise.
Yeah, platonic guardians. So I think it's a bad direction to take, a flouting of the law, and that's why, at the end of the day, when people flout the courts or flout the law, they have to be held to account for that. I'm worried about the breakdown of the rule of law, and part of that is the idea that you can just disregard the rulings of the court.
Well, on that note, I just want to thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
I really appreciate the conversation. And I'd like to especially thank the Institute of Politics. You guys are really it's so impressive, and you're so fortunate to have such a terrific organization bringing people together. And finally, the questions from the students were, I think, the best questions I've ever heard in an event like this. They were terrific. So I'm not surprised.
They're the best I've heard.
Yeah.
Because this is the only event like this
ever. But anyway, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.